All right. So I am just. Let me look at the camera actually. Um, so I'm just gonna throw this out there. Um, not gonna really do much editing with this because this is just something that's just so spontaneous. Um, and I've been sort of circling with a lot of emotions about this. Have any of y'all had an experience where you hop into a tabletop RPG of some kind? Could take your pick. Could be D&D, World of Darkness, anything. Whatever system you like. And you hop into a game with the GM, and you start playing along. And as you play, you start to think, some of these decisions that are being made are kind of questionable. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? But it's nothing that, in your mind, breaks the game for you, that causes you to leave. It's not the horror stories of the 400 rules that one D&D GM made, and things like that. It's not a horror story level choice. It's just choices that confound you. Where you're like, I don't know why they made that decision, but it's not terrible, so sure, we're gonna go through. Um, and then this keeps happening, where certain things are done, certain decisions are made, and you feel like all these decisions are creating this odd pattern. And before you know it, the game has completely devolved into something completely different than what you expected. Something into just completely that's off the rails, that doesn't get around to the point where you're stuck in limbo. You and your characters are stuck in limbo. You're doing the exact same thing over and over, just waiting for the story to move on. But everyone else is refusing to move on. The GM is refusing to move on. Many of the players are not. And then a few players are sharing that sentiment, and then just cause a whole rift and everything. And there's problems. And anyways, that is something that I've recently went through here. I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to call anyone out because I think that's very unfair. Because this is not a hit piece on anyone. This is just sort of a personal journaling, if you will. I made a few notes in a little notebook here, just on things that I experienced, mostly negative things. I will talk about a few things that I learned from this that were good, because I don't think any bad experience is completely void of good things to pull from it. And just a way for me to vent, because this is something that very recently happened, and a lot of emotions are just swirling and swirling, and I want to get them on paper. And if other people feel the same way, then I hope that this is just some sort of catharsis for you, or someone, something to connect to or relate to. So I'm gonna set the stage, and then we're just gonna hop right into sort of what happened. So, for reference, this is in a small-ish community of people. They're shared around one of the people's personal projects. They're working on a very personal, passion project that they want to get off the ground. Get moving somewhere to become something. They want it to be something. So a lot of us are in this community to support them. Because we believe in their idea. We think that there's value in it, and that it should be something that succeeds. And I still stand by that. The people that are involved with this project are wonderful, very, very accommodating people. They make great characters. They're very good at creating unique characters, very inspired by a lot of different media. Very good at making characters. Very memorable and very thoughtful characters. So we're there. There's a community of us. The server is relatively large, but the active community is quite small. Maybe around 15 to 20 of us, right? So not very big. However, I joined in relatively late, because we were mutual people, mutual friends. from other communities involving things like writing and tabletop RPGs, that kind of thing. Just kind of running into each other in different places. And I find out that they have a whole community for their personal project. And so I am like, hey, I want to hop on in. I want to support you. And so I hop into this community and I immediately get invested because a lot of my other online friends are there. And we're having a grand old time. And then I find out that they actually have an RP set in the world that they're promoting. And I'm a huge fan of tabletop RPGs. I love them. It was around that time that I was really big into D&D 5e, just when it was starting to sort of creep into the mainstream a little bit more. And so I was all in. I was like, hey, I want to make characters for this. I've got plenty of ideas, inspired by a lot of the concepts that they make, because they have really good concepts that I think are really fun. And so I make characters and everything. And then it took a little bit of time, but I hopped into the RP and had a great time. It was text-based. It wasn't voice-based. It was text-based. And it was a good time. I was enjoying playing my characters. The main problem was that my main character was kind of aloof. That was part of his character, that he was kind of, very silent. Others had to sort of approach him and engage with him, and I felt like that was fun. Some people were a little agitated by it because it would force them to engage with my character instead of me going out and engaging with them. And I admit that that's kind of a problem, sort of almost a little arrogant, like, you come to me first and interact with me. But I eventually made other characters that were more proactive. Anyways, so, it starts off fine, and this particular RP doesn't have a system. It's not a unified system, in fact. It's kind of just going off vibes for the most part. Not very concrete rules per se. It's more like a sandbox. That was kind of what it was pitched to me as. It was a sandbox. And it was a fun time because, who doesn't like a nice sandbox experience, exploring things that you care about. And, it's a fun time. And then at some point, there's a bit of a brick wall that we hit. I will be honest, I don't fully remember what this brick wall was. What caused it or anything. But basically, the RP kind of hit a dead stop at some point. And, people weren't being engaged, people weren't being involved, and the GMs, who were the ones that were, in charge of this community, of this project, they were like, hey, I noticed that a lot of people are not engaged with this. Why don't we restart? Why don't we do a fresh start? And do something new? And there were people that were complaining like, oh, but I want to keep going. But then a majority of us were like, no, I think a refresh is a good idea. We should restart. Brand new slate, especially with new people coming in because there were new people joining in on the action. Let's restart. A nice clean slate so that everyone can be on the same page because people were joining in late a bunch. And so they were missing out on a whole bunch of things that were happening before. So getting everyone on the same page, really good idea. So we start in the second campaign, and this is where things started to really decline. I didn't realize it at the time that this was the start of something really bad happening. I felt like this was just normal because I didn't know any better. But in hindsight, I should have seen the signs, I should have seen the warnings, and I probably should have just stepped away from the game. And I'm going to explain why. So in the second game, basically what people did is they kept their roster of characters. Some people, did new characters. And that's the key thing, is that also every player involved had multiple characters, like multiple player characters. So imagine you're playing a game of D&D, and instead of playing one character sheet, you're playing 2 or 3. And I will say really quickly that kind of one of the problems that eventually spiraled was that people were making way too many characters. Some of these players were making around 6 or 7 total character sheets, like straight up character sheets. And that was just kind of absurd to me. I understand that a lot of people get really invested in characters and they like to make a bunch of characters, especially in like a tabletop scenario. You know, we get really obsessive. We creatives, we like to tunnel vision on things and really, like to obsess over things. Especially making, characters and making them interesting and likable, or, making them likable to hate, that kind of thing. Just making characters that are memorable. And that was kind of the first problem, is that nobody stepped in and said, hey, maybe we should cut down on how many player characters you could make, Like, there was just no limit. It was just, you want a new character? Go ahead, make it. And, I didn't really care that much on that because I kept my roster relatively small. I did expand a little bit. I did add a few characters. At most, I would have had 5 characters. Would have, and I'll get into later why. I would have had 5, but for the most part, I had 4. And again, that might sound like insanity to a lot of people. Why would you ever play 4 characters in a full-on RPG? And, I felt like it was fine. The pace that we had, I was like, it's okay. We got 4 characters, can explore new options, like, different character arcs and, just making them different and unique, And it's like a sandbox. Who cares, right? Lo and behold, that would also become a problem. And I'll talk about that. Again, I've got a list here. I'm going to break them down, but I'm just setting the stage. So we have this second game going, and things are starting all right because we are, basically a lot of us are refurbishing the old characters and sort of adapting them to this new environment. Not very different from the first one, but still, we want to account for it, right? We're getting character connections sort of set up sometimes, but for the most part, most of the cast, which at this point is around 20-something, like player characters, or maybe even more. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's a lot. It's a lot of quote-unquote main characters in the story. Some of them in antagonistic roles, but most of them are, protagonist status, right? So we start the game, and things are going swell. We've got, we're hitting it off with the first big encounters. And to put it into reference, it's set in a high school. It's kind of like an urban thing. I'm not going to go into too many details because that might give away of what it is. But people who know me, they know what I'm talking about. People in that community, they know what I'm talking about. But anyways, it's a school environment, so we structured it of like, we're going to interact on school days, so each day is going to be a period of time where you can interact with one another and all that stuff. And then on some of these days, weird stuff's going to happen, and that's going to be moments where you all need to figure out what is going on. That's going to be sort of the kicking off, the inciting incident of trying to figure out the main plot. And so that established that the main plot was going to be intrigue-based, basically a mystery. What's going on, trying to figure out what's going on, why are these things happening, who's behind it, all that stuff. Weird stuff. Again, I can't go into details because that would just give away who it is and what it is and everything. And I want to remain anonymous. I want them to remain anonymous, so I'm not going to dox anyone. So, yeah, and they're like, okay, that makes sense. We ease into the connections. We have sort of a starting. Sort of light interactions, setting the scene, letting us get used to the environment. And then we kick off with the very first big inciting incident. And this is, and just think about when I first said about inklings of big problems happening before, right? Where you start a game and some people make decisions or something happens and you're like, that shouldn't be normal, but whatever. This is sort of the beginnings of that experience. where there were some decisions in the inciting incident that basically spelled trouble for the rest of the game. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, to set a little bit more context, so with the first game that we did, the very first one that I joined in late on, the GMs for it, they also had player characters. Now, in the tabletop community, that is a very tricky thing to pull off, is, GM controlled player characters. It is very tricky to do. You need to be very cognizant of how you play those characters to avoid them becoming the focal point of the story, so that it doesn't feel like it's your game, And the decision for this inciting incident was to focus on, and I'm not going to explain why, because that would, again, just give things away. That would explain why. I'm sorry, let me back up. I'm going to cut this out. The main problem was that this particular inciting incident was focused on one of the GM player characters. It was all about this character. Basically hinged completely on this character. And this was a moment where me and other players kind of thought, this is actually kind of weird. Like, you're making this event, this inciting incident that is supposed to kick off this mystery for us, and your player character is very central to it. Now, it's not saying that they're the only one that can solve it, but that the event itself is very heavily centered on this character. And so a few players, I can't remember who, but there were a group of us that were like, hey, this doesn't feel right to do. Like, that doesn't feel fair, because, your character is, you're the GM, you get to control it and everything, but, we're just player characters, and that doesn't seem fair to us, it doesn't seem fair. And actually, I got to put this addendum in as well, that so throughout the story, this inciting incident is sort of a weird anomaly that happens. And it's literally like a causal anomaly where the world actually shifts. Very weird. But us as players, we would eventually be encouraged to design and run our own. So we are kind of acting as GMs in some weird way. That could spell a problem for sure, and a lot of you are already probably thinking that that's a big red flag. But since it was a relatively small community, we just trusted one another that we would be able to run them properly. And spoiler alert, it didn't go well. So yeah. But anyways, so this inciting incident, focusing on this one player character that's run by the GM, and we come to him and we say, hey, this is kind of problematic. This is kind of unfair, because if no one interacts with your GM player character, then they're just going to be left in the dust. They're not going to be important at all. If they've got their own thing going on, if they're just trying to focus on the main adventure, the main plot, then, then they're just going to be left in the dust. Those characters are not going to matter at all, right? We brought this up to them. And the GM, they just went, yeah, that's true, but you also get to design your own. And also, you can make your own, so if you want something to focus on, just make it on your own. And most of us were like, I guess that's fair, because we do get to make these events. This is just the first one, right? This is just the first one. So we continue. We go through this event. And then we realize, wait a second, this is going way too long. Like, what's happening here? It's taking way too long. We're some of our characters are literally just sitting around, doing nothing, just waiting for this to end. Not everyone is engaging. There's plenty of characters that are trying to figure out what's going on, but there's other characters that are just sitting somewhere, just trying to survive, because this is actually a very dire situation, very bad. that is literally threatening a lot of the characters' lives. Some people decide that the best decision, in character, mind you, because they're playing characters, is to just hold up in a location and just wait it out. Hopefully someone comes along and fixes the problem. Some people are going out to fix the problem, just sitting there. And that just left a lot of people sitting and twiddling their thumbs, waiting for this event to end, because nobody was figuring out what to do to end the thing. And so there's characters just sitting around doing nothing. And that means also that some players, not just characters, whole players were just sitting by waiting for this to end. So again, to recap, we have the inciting incident, which is very heavily focused on the GMPC, which, again, not inherently a bad thing. But then also we have a huge cast of players and characters, both, that are a good number of them that are just sitting somewhere doing nothing, waiting for this to end because that's their rational decision, because they're playing their characters, right? And this was just, and this was really the point where I was like, this is not really working out as well. But you know what? I'm going to stick through to it because I really care about these people. I really care about these characters. I want to see it to the end. So I'm going to stick to it, okay? I'm going to stick to it. And then things just got worse and worse and worse. Scenes got longer. More player characters were added to just add to the bloat. There was basically this construction of a nucleus where this player character with his GM, created and played player character was effectively a black hole for every other character. If you do not engage with this character, your character did not matter in the slightest. They were never mentioned or brought up, ever. They were never relevant to the story. And then, of course, there were problems as well with allowing players to run their own side plots, effectively introducing, tertiary antagonists that were run by the player characters to oppose their own characters. So that's just a sampling plate of just the core problems of what went wrong with this game. So let me just start with the first and most obvious problem with this whole game, and that was the choice of system. Now, there are a lot of systems out there that you could pick that would run very, very well for a text-based game, especially a text-based game with a lot of players. There's plenty of games that I don't know about, but there is one game that I think is very perfect for this, especially for the style of play that we engaged in. And, the people who are going to hear this, they're going to groan when I say this. It's Fate Core. Now, the reason that those people are probably groaning, or they're like, oh God, why is he talking about this, is because to spoiler alert, this second game ended, by the way, recently. And we're trying to start a new one. And I was like, hey, actually, it would start first, that the old GM decided, hey, this is too much on me. I'm going to step down as GM. And I was like, hey, I'd be willing to step in and be a GM. I have some experience with running games. I've run games of Mage of the Ascension, D&D, some games of like Fate Core, other games. I've had experience with running games, right? And I suggested Fate Core a while back, but that was shut down immediately, which honestly, that was a fair decision to make, because transitioning to a new system in the middle of a game is a terrible decision. But anyways, so I decided, hey, I want to step up as a GM, and that was the system that we had agreed on. That we were like, hey, we took a vote, and that was the majority vote. Now, as we went along and as players started to learn about the system slowly, and some people not really learning the system, if I'm being honest, people were very hesitant. There were people that are like, I don't know if I want to play this system. And so we're currently in a stage, as of recording this right now, we're in a stage of figuring out what to do next, because we've mostly agreed that the system is not going to work because for whatever reason. Mostly, I think that it was because of just not familiarity and not being used to the pace of the game. And for those that are, that know me and know what I'm talking about, you can debate me all you want, but I'm gonna stand by my opinion that Fate Core was the best system choice. Anyways, that's a digression. What was the system we chose for the second game? Well, it's a game that maybe not a lot of you know about. I never knew about it when I heard it, but it's called Big Eyes, Small Mouth. It's shortened to BESM, which I hate saying that because it sounds like I'm saying BDSM. Anyways, so this system, for those who don't know, is a D20 system that's inspired a lot and actually pulls, basically acting as sort of like a layer on top of 3rd edition D&D. Just straight up 3rd edition D&D. So a lot of its mechanics can feel janky and outdated because 3rd edition in D&D was kind of jank. Anyways, so this system, it might not seem a bad idea. It's a very anime-inspired system, by the way. That's why it's named that. And this setting is very anime-inspired, so it made sense, Now, why was this setting such a poor choice? Well, I really think that the main problem with this is that we were able to design level 3 characters with absurd stat spreads. Okay? Let me put this for a reference. We had player characters that had over 100 HP, that had high enough armor, not armor class, but armor that even if an attack landed, the character would not suffer any point of damage whatsoever. And characters that were so overpowered that it just killed any fun to engage with them in any kind of combat scenario. So you might be wondering, how does this work? Well, to really briefly explain, so BESM is, your standard D20 system, so you have classes to pick between, and you have races and all that stuff. Because people in this community really like, player freedom and customization, we were very loose and allowed a lot of homebrewing, which is fair, I engaged in some homebrewing myself, and things like that. But then we made a few decisions that were not very smart, I think. So a core thing about the system is that you have your classes, right? But then you also have additional character points besides your class that you can spend to purchase new attributes, new powers, new abilities. So this could be something like, for example, shape-shifting. Or you could pick up things like mind control or telepathy or magic, like fireballs and things like that. It's a very loose system, and a lot of people really liked it for its flexibility, that they had all these options to pick between, Very old school style where they just list out a bajillion different things for you to pick between. They also had the option to homebrew too, Anyways, so that might not sound like a big deal because it's like you just have points, you just spend them on the features, and hopefully the features are balanced. And the features are not balanced point-wise, I would say, especially a few things that are not balanced, but that's not even the worst part. Because, for example, there is one feature in this system that allows you to take a special attack, okay? And this special attack you can customize with a whole bunch of different features. So you could make it, for example, a melee attack that does damage over time. Could be something like a flaming attack or something, I don't know. Or it could be like a spreading attack of some kind that is in a cone, but there's limitations to it. So it has this, take and give kind of thing. This is not even the worst of it, because the worst part of this is that on top of these points that you can spend to purchase new stuff, you can also take defects that give you bonus points to spend on more of these. Now, you might be wondering, that's not really a big deal. Like, other games have that. World of Darkness has, you can take defects and things like that for extra points. The reason that that works in World of Darkness is because there's a cap to how many points you can get, to how many defects you can take. We did not stipulate a limitation. We did not. There was no limitation for defects. You could take any defect you want. You could take all of them at max power to get the most points possible to purchase already broken abilities, and also, mind you, bump their actual stats beyond 20. Again, this is a D20 system. A stat of 20 means a +5. You can push your stats at this point. Again, we're level 3. We're beginning characters, and we're already shooting past 20 character stats, like a stat of 20. And we have characters that are taking all the defects in the book, basically, purchasing the most powerful abilities in the book, and overshadowing everyone else, demolishing them in every single scenario. And this doesn't help that some of the players have an inclination towards power gaming. And that's not derogatory or anything. Power gaming is a neutral thing. People who want to be powerful in their games, there is nothing wrong with that. But if that is at the expense of other players, then there is something wrong. And this is not even me complaining about the players. This is me complaining about the GM. Because the GM never put their foot down on any kind of limitations whatsoever when it came to these features. They were just like, yeah, sure, go ahead, take these defects. And the worst part is that a lot of these defects in the rules are almost inconsequential to the game as a whole. For example, one of the defects is called Girl Guy Magnet. What is the defect, you ask? The problem is that you are too chased after by people who want to be in love with you. That is the defect. Now, inherently, that's not a bad idea. Because if your character is someone who despises that or doesn't want that, or if their main conflict is romance or whatever, and that's another thing I'll get into. If that is something that you want to genuinely play out as a consequence and let the GM play out as a consequence, that is totally fine. But the problem is that responsibility, that burden was on you, the player, to play that out, not the GM. The GM very rarely interacted with player defects, at least ones that were sort of narrative focused, like those, because there are some that are mechanically balanced, like for example, you take extra damage from a certain damage type, or for example, you have lower skill points because your character isn't that smart, or you have lower hit points, whatever. Mechanical stuff that just happens on your sheet. Any narrative focused ones, like for example, Nemesis, where you have a separate NPC that is an antagonist to your character, that is a constant threat to them, that responsibility was on you, the player, to actually engage with it. Something that the GM should have run. Something that a game master would have taken every opportunity to engage with. That is a gift. Any game master out there, please chime in with me here and say that a player giving you some kind of flaw or defect to play with, that is a gift from heaven. That is prime opportunity for you to play with these characters. Now, granted, this is compounded by the problem that we have around 11 to 14 players each of which at least has 3 characters. Do the rough math, that's around 33 characters at least. And that's not even counting the players that had around 6 to 7 player characters. You see the problem? So that's our first problem, right? First problem is poor choice of system. Second thing I already touched on already was player characters for the GM. Now, technically there were multiple GMs involved. There were 2 of them technically. But one of them was very much on the game side of it, where they were the rules lawyer, being like clarifying rules, right? And then the other GM was sort of the story person. They were the ones that were organizing the narrative, trying to, the main plot, whatever. They both had player characters. That's tricky to pull off, but if you do it right, it's good. And I aforementioned that these player characters, that one of these player characters especially, became a very central figure in the entire plot. With the inciting incident that was very focused on them. But that was just the beginning. Because as the story went on, that character became so prominent and so prevalent that whenever that character entered into the scene, no one cared about any other character in the scene. Nobody. They were the center of attention, and that was in character in many ways because that character was actually a pop star. They were very popular, all right? And they had, fans, right? So contextually, that makes sense. But when you have a character in your party, when you're playing a game like D&D, like a rogue, and they start rifling through your bags trying to steal the gold you picked up, and out of character, you complain with them, being like, hey, this is not really nice. And then they say, well, it's what my character would do. That's exactly what the experience was. That's how it felt. So we have this player character, very central in the inciting incident, and then they grow in significance afterwards, so much so that your relevance in the whole scheme of the game was based on if you actually interacted with this character or not. That's a very bad recipe for GMs taking the spotlight. And that's effectively what happened. And we complained about this. We as players banded together and we were like, hey, this is not a good thing. This is not a healthy thing for this game. And the GM just wrote it off. Just like, well, it makes sense. Or, whatever other reason. Basically, we had pushback and nothing was done about it. We even had, we made a channel to talk about it. We were like, hey, this is such a problem. We need to have a separate discussion about this problem specifically plaguing this game. And it really went nowhere. We just it's whatever. Sweep it on the rug. I would not be upset by this. I would not. If this didn't compound on itself to the point where it actually kind of almost took over my real emotions. And this is another thing we'll get into later. So those are the 2 problems so far. We got system problems because the main system is just terrible. I'm sorry, GM that's probably watching this. It's a terrible system. I don't care what you think. I love you. I care about you. But I think that the system is absolutely dog water. Then secondly, the usage of GM-played player characters, they became so central. There were 2 characters that actually became central, but this one character was especially irritating because of a later reason that I'll talk about. They became so central that they were effectively the main characters of the game. So problem 3. Now to problem 3. Side plots. So I briefly mentioned this before, that players, with these sort of inciting incidents, these weird anomalies that are happening, we have the opportunity as players to make our own and run them, as sort of like fun little events, where, oh, it's time for this person to run the weird anomaly thing, time to go, and all that stuff. They also permitted us to basically run our own character-led plots of, my character is, experiencing this problem because of a family member or this rival or enemy or whatever. Basically, anything that a GM would run for your characters as side plots, that responsibility was pushed onto us, the players. Which, think about it, and a lot of you might be like, ugh, that's a bad thing. Why would I do that? That's a recipe for disaster. You are correct. But I was of the mindset that I hoped that these players would understand restraint and respect for other players and their plots. And boy, was that wrong. Because by near the end, if this campaign had continued moving on any further to like the actual conclusion of the game, we would have probably converged on 5 different apocalypses. I'm not even joking, that is not hyperbole. We would have had a 5-way apocalypse of the actual Earth of some kind because of the scale of the plots that the players were making. They wanted conclusions to be literally the end of the world. 5, at least 5. That might be generous. 3 to 4 to 5. Roughly around that number. 5. And these were players. Players who were engaging in this. While there's also a main plot that the GM is running that we're not communicating with. Because we're players. We can run them however we want. Doesn't matter. It's your plot. Do whatever. And I ran along with this, right? Because I was not told any expectations of scale. So, just to talk a little bit about my characters, very briefly. My very first character, who was very aloof, to pull off the Band-Aid, he is from other Earths. He is kind of like a world hopper. Not by choice, though, because it's an accident. My main conception for the character at the very first time was basically, what if an ordinary kid was thrown into a combination of Mad Max plus Cormac McCarthy's The Road? An ordinary kid, swept up from his ordinary life, thrown into a horrific apocalyptic meat grinder. And then he escapes from it. From that apocalyptic Earth to a normal Earth again. So on one side, he's a normal kid. He goes through horrific trauma, comes out the other side a completely different person. That was my conception. Now, I will admit, I really did go balls to the wall with his story like others did. Where basically the main plot would have culminated in the very end, basically establishing that the apocalyptic Earth he came from and the normal Earth were merging. Why? Because he's supposed to be in the apocalyptic world, but since he escaped, now that apocalyptic Earth is coming to him, and the only way to stop that happening is for him to go back. So that means very juicy drama. That's a very hard choice to make, especially because he had a romance involved. He had a very strong romantic connection with someone else, with another character, which I still cherish very much. And the player who plays that character, I love you, and I love that character and their romance. I will hold on to that forever. However, that's just one of the 5. So I contributed to the problem. I will admit, I contributed to it. But I did not expect that to actually be a problem. I thought that was fine. I was like, it's okay, because this is a sandbox, right? This is whatever. Lo and behold, I find out that other people had similar ideas of causing the world to come to this very big cataclysmic event. That doesn't really work well when you're trying to make a climax, especially if the climax is just relegated as like the focal point of your character, who is just one of 30-some player characters. I didn't think that through, and that was a mistake I made. And I think that while the impact of such an event would have been very heartbreaking and dramatic, like it would have had impact for sure, I realized the mistake, and I realized the problem with that is that I was trying to basically one-up others. I wanted to make my stories as bombastic and dramatic as possible and be memorable. And that is because of the fourth problem. And this fourth problem I call the black hole. What is this black hole, you ask? So, this player character, run by the GM, who's very popular, who is very central to the inciting incident, right? That's just kind of a side note. It's whatever. What's more important is that they become more relevant as the story goes on. This character, in particular, they are a playboy by character and by persona. Deep down, they are quite the softy. They're quite the good-natured person, but the persona they put on is of a very flirty playboy. That's the persona. And there's a reason that that character puts up that persona. It's a very serious reason, a very good reason. So, very well-written character. However, the GM decides that the best way to use this trait of this character is to effectively start an insane singularity that eventually grows to the point where you are forced to interact with this character whether you like it or not. And if you don't be proactive about it, if you don't step in, then he's going to make it happen for you, and it's going to be something terrible for you. Now, this is where it gets very personal for me. So in the first game, I made a character, one of my main characters. He was kind of an insert, I will admit, in good ways and bad ways. But the main reason that he was there, an insert, was to effectively sort of play out a little bit of a cathartic romance. Now, it doesn't help that I have been single for years at this point. And so I wanted something nice. And I went to this player with the other character. I was like, hey, I think that these two characters, based on personality, would be nice. And I want to, ship them, And that was a big part of the community also. Shipping. Shipping was huge. Being like, I like this character and this character together and everything like that. And, I've got no problem with shipping culture. It's fine. Do what you want. I don't care. But we were behind the scenes like, hey, we want this to be something that we develop. We want this, this is something that I think that would be fun. First game, I go really overboard with this. I am making images, to celebrate the ship and everything, and I'm talking about it all the time, being like, this is really nice. And that weirds out one of the higher-ups in the community they're not the GM, but they're in like the GM team basically because they're a creator of this property. They were uncomfortable with it because I was getting a little too obsessive with it. And the problem, and here's the thing, I understand that because I was getting a little out of hand. But my problem was this, that I was never told that it made them uncomfortable. They never came to me in private, like, as it was happening, and asked me, hey, could you tone this down? This was after the game ended, where they decided to step back from everything. They didn't participate in the second game. They just stepped away, and then eventually they DM'd me, or someone else DM'd me, and they said, hey, by the way, this is something that was really uncomfortable with them afterwards. And look, I understand, and I understand. And I don't fault them for feeling uncomfortable, because truly that was really bad of me to do. And I learned from that. I was like, okay, I can't do this. So me and this player with these two characters, we move into the second game, and we're like, hey, we're going to continue this, right? We're going to continue with this, nice little relationship. In fact, we're going to establish that they're old friends, because before they were just strangers. This time they're old friends that drifted apart because of tragedy, right? Something bad happens to this one character, and the other character really wants to be there for them. But this character moves on, they become calloused, they're so wrapped up in vengeance. And so this other character, who's very gentle, very soft, who wants to bring this other character out of that vengeful life. And we hop into the second game, and we're going fine. And then there are moments that happen with this main player character, with this black hole swirling. It's growing and swirling. Other characters being pulled in. And basically, it became a joke that this character was going to have a whole harem of girls falling for him. That was the purpose of his existence, by the way. Not the full purpose, but that was a big part of his character. And a big thing that we joked about was this character, he's acquiring girls in his harem. So we get into the second game, and me and this player, we're working with, we're designing nice moments, okay? We have the bumps that happen. There are some things that were planned and not planned that were basically hurdles to get over. And then this GM player character steps into the scene. Steps in between this relationship that we want to foster together. Something that me and this player, again, are working together to develop. And he sucks it into his harem black hole. And especially since after I made this character in a time where I was feeling lonely and desperate for a connection of some kind. We have a GM with his player character stepping in between and causing problems that we didn't ask for. And if I'm getting emotional, if it looks like I'm getting emotional about it, it's because I poured so much into this character. I poured so much into the relationship, like almost real. And of course, it's not real. I don't think I'm not delusional in thinking that this connection is somehow satisfying me or anything. But I like to see happy things happen. And the GM is very adamant about causing problems for the sake of causing problems. That if there's something too nice happening in this game, he's going to take that black hole and sweep through it with it. Like a duster. And honestly, after what happened with the first game with the other sort of GM person that felt uncomfortable, after inklings of the black hole sort of pulling on this relationship and possibly leading to spaghettification, I just shut up. I never wanted to talk about it ever again. I never made posts. I never made comments on it. I just played it as is because it hurt me so much to see something that we wanted to make just be completely trounced by interference that we did not ask for, that was not consulted. At least I wasn't consulted, which I feel like I should have, because it was, again, me and this player, a mutual agreement. Hey, we want this to be an arc that we want to develop. And I don't know if this other player, I trust this other player that they would be honest with me if this other player came to them, if the GM came to them and asked them, hey, can I cause some trouble? But I didn't hear anything from them. And this GM swept through and ruined it so hard. especially when this was a character that I bled so much into. That character bled into me and I bled into them. We were melding so hard that any time there was an instance of that black hole coming close, I just had to shut it all down. I just had to take it. I had to take days away from the screen to regain some semblance of sanity because of how hard it hurt. And again, this is after the GM gave us prerogative to design our own little plots and arcs. And the GM just had to stick their hand into the pie and ruin probably one of the most beautiful romances that I think I've probably written or been involved in. Fictional romances. I'm a very emotional person. I think that's very clear. I'm a very tender-hearted person, so I get very easily emotionally attached to people and characters. I'm an easy crier when it comes to fiction. If there is a very tragic moment, I will cry. But what's more tragic is that I wanted to make something that was full of struggle and ups and downs. And then it's just interrupted by another character that, frankly, we didn't ask for. Not once were we basically asked permission to do this. The GM just did it. Just did it. Without any establishing, hey, with these romances, I'm going to try and cause some trouble, He never established that. He just did it. And others were fine with it because they didn't have like a planned mindset. They were just like, we're just going through it. But we planned it ahead of time. We were like, hey, we want this to be an arc that we develop. And really, and what made it so much worse is that whenever I went to the GM and I told them, hey, I'm actually being affected by this, like this actually hurts. This hurts me to see happen. Can we please ease off on this? And then the GM's point to bring up, the excuse was, well, things can change. That relationship isn't going to last, It's not dynamic. Who said it was your story to tell? Huh? I'm sorry, GM, but you gave us the players, the ability to create our stories, to create arcs that we wanted to follow. You said that was fine. You gave us that. And also you gave us with no expectation that you would insert yourself into those situations and cause trouble. Because this happened other times. Other players, and this stems from the GM PC being so central to everything. It's the black hole. It sucked everyone in. If you were not part of it, you weren't relevant. And eventually it was just, you're part of it. You have no choice. Whether you like it or not, you're getting involved with this character. And especially in a way that you're not going to like. That's going to cause problems for you. Again, I would not be so upset if it wasn't for the fact that we were not told this. We were not told. And it really, really, really hurt me for a long time. That, plus the first time of just being obsessive, it burned me so hard that I never wanted to talk about it. And I still feel embarrassed to. I feel like if I bring it up, I'm going to be lambasted for it. And doesn't it suck when you feel so embarrassed, even in a community that wants to foster making good characters and making likable characters? where you feel so pushed down that you can't talk about it. So those were the core problems that we dealt with. Those are the problems we dealt with. So with all of that negativity out of the way, what are some things that I learned? Well, first one I would say is if you see any inklings of very questionable GM decisions, sometimes it's better to just bounce and save yourself the trouble instead of sticking through. There was another player who recently decided to return after finding out that the prior game ended and the new one was beginning. They left the second game very early after feeling all these problems surmounting, the animosity coming from the GM with the player characters and the black hole, the terrible system in place that made things imbalanced, the side plots that players had free reign to control and decide whatever they wanted. All these things, he realized he had incredible foresight, and I feel stupid for not joining him. I feel stupid for not joining him. So in recent times, fast forwarding, this will line up with what I learned. So recent times, the game is grinding to a halt, primarily because we had this very strict daily structure to the game of we're playing this day, and then once that day is over, we're moving on to the next one and whatever. And that was a problem itself. We had no structure in terms of timing. Scenes kept going on for so long that it just dragged it out and turned into a slog. That's a whole other problem that was part of it that I didn't even mention. But anyways, it's grinding to a halt. People are losing motivation. So the GM comes together and says, hey, I realize that a lot of people are not having motivation to continue. Why don't we start again? A fresh start. This time with more clarity. And also, I'm going to step back as GM. I'll let other people GM the game. And I was obviously first one to say, I want to be a part of this. Because I want to make this better. So then I decide, hey, we're going to do Fate Core. I want to bring this up. Of course, everyone voted. And Fate Core won the vote. Primarily, I think it might have just been out of familiarity because that was something I pitched way back in the second game. And that was immediately shut down. Everyone was like, no, we don't want to change systems, which, I mean, fair response to have. But then I bring up Fate Core, and I think it's a perfect system. Because what do the players want? They want narrative more than, mechanics to crunch. They want narrative. They want something that's more simple, something that allows us to be rewarded for problems and mistakes to occur in the narrative, and something that players can easily jump into. It's something that's intuitive. And I think that Fate Core fits all of those things. Now, it took a while. We basically voted on it. We were like, okay. So I went right to work to basically help people get up to speed. Some people were already familiar with the system and already off to the races, and it was great. And then there were people that had trepidations. And I understand why, because it's a new system. It's daunting to learn a new system. But it was such a matter of reading the rules, especially when I had poured full afternoons writing a whole guide to how to play the game. I'm not even joking. I'm not going to show it on screen, but I'm going to pull it up. I'm going to count it. There are, based on different chapters, 14 pages for basic rules, 13 pages for additional rules, principles of play, unique rules that we're using, and then 15 pages for character creation. That's about roughly 45 pages total I wrote 45 some pages. And that's not even counting other things that I wrote behind the scenes. I also made charts as well to help run the anomaly events that people were going to eventually run, and also for players to run their own plots, because Fate Core has a really ingenious card for game masters to run their plots, and I just ripped that, I stole it, and adapted it for players so they could run their plots in an easier way. I poured so much time into that, expecting this to be the case, and then now we're in talks of changing the system, and the vote has basically gone through that we're going to change the system. And initially, after hearing this, my response was, well, if we're changing systems, I'm stepping down as GM. I can't handle this. I can't do this. If I already poured so much time into something that I was passionate about and really thought that it would work, and it was all just for nothing, then I just don't want to be involved. And I seriously contemplated just straight up leaving. Just leaving the game. And I'm still debating that in my mind. It depends on certain circumstances. It really depends. It does. But what matters to me most, and this is another thing that I've learned, is that after talking with this other player who left early, who saw the same problems that I did, and left before he experienced them, and good on him for that, he basically lent me an ear to vent all these frustrations that you guys have been hearing from me, vented everything from the system to the GM behavior to the side plots, the black hole, everything that I've discussed so far. He lent me an ear, and he was very calm and assuring of, yeah, I understand that these are problems. And I realized that if I just abandoned the potential to make this game better, then I'm no better. I'm no better than this GM. And again, I want to reemphasize that this GM and everyone who was in the GM team who was working on it, I love you and I respect you immensely. I don't want you to mistake my grievances for personal grievances against you as human beings. Because again, this is just a game. We should not attach our worth to a game. And I learned my mistake. That's actually one of the things I learned. I'll really quickly talk about that. But after this player talked to me and he lent me my ear and I vented to him and we just talked about everything, I've officially decided that for this game going forward, I am not stepping down as co-GM. There are going to be 3 of us that are co-GMing this. I'm not stepping down. And for players who heard me say that I was going to step down, I've changed my mind. Because that would be very cowardly of me to do that. And that would be very weak of me to just run away at the slightest hint of not getting my way. So I've decided, yes, I'm going to continue with this game. I'm going to be co-GMing it. I don't care what system it is. Frankly, even if it's plain D&D 5e, which I kind of loathe now, even if it was that, I would stick around and do what I can to make the best game that I can because I really care about making this game succeed. At first, I cared about the system succeeding, but I've quickly learned that what matters more is for the players. Caring about the system succeeding, that was just me. That was all about myself. Because then that would make me look awesome. Of like, look at this new system that looks awesome and everyone loves it and it's going so well. That was all about me. That was all ego. And I don't want that to be the centerpiece of why I run a game. Because I've learned of the problems from other experiences as well, of what happens when ego gets in the way of running a game. And again, to the GM that's out there, that's hearing this, that's hearing me say this about them again, I love you. I care about you. I want what's best for you. This is not anything malicious about your character. But sometimes we have to be honest about how we feel and how we perceive things. And frankly, that's how I felt. I felt like it was all about winning and ego and wanting to win, wanting to be on top, and wanting to look the best. So I'm just going to make it clear. What did I learn? If you see signs of very questionable decisions, it's better to run and save yourself the pain of being stuck in a loop and being invested in a loop that almost feels abusive. 2, if you're a GM, you need structure in your game. If you are a GM, you cannot be lackadaisical when it comes to running a game with players. Because if you do not put boundaries and borders down, they will trounce over those boundaries and just ruin the game. Sometimes players don't know what's best for them. Sometimes they'll make decisions that are not best for the game. So setting boundaries is good for a GM. You need to have structure. And GMs are the ones who are responsible for that. That is something you can't pawn off to someone else. If you are a game master of any system, regardless of how rules light or rules crunchy it is, you need structure in your game. You need to have control over the game. You can't sit back lazily and just let players run it for you. You're the game master. You have to master the game. Run it. Don't just sit back and let the players do it for you. And last thing that I've learned from this is not stepping down from a challenge, especially when it comes to a system that you're not familiar with. I don't know what system we're going to do. I hope it's not BESM, and I doubt it is. In fact, if it is, that is probably going to be the final straw. That is the only case that I will leave if we are back to square one, because then it will be a pointless fight. But if it's something else, if it's anything else, I am remaining. And I will make this game as good as possible with my co-GMs. I'll make it as good as I can. And to any other GMs that are out there that are maybe observing this behaviors in their own game, maybe stop it. Maybe self-reflect. Am I running a game in a way that is too lax, that doesn't have structure, that is so focused on me as the one in charge, that's not focusing on the players as the centerpiece? Maybe take some introspection. And I'm going to need a lot of that introspection myself. I know the players, when going through the process of establishing Fate Core, I made a lot of mistakes. I overstepped boundaries. I made decisions that were very, very stupid. Honestly, I was stupid when I made some of those decisions, and I rolled them back because I realized how dumb they were. So I just don't want anyone else to go through this experience themselves. That's all I wanted to say. This is not airing of grievances and telling you to harass whoever this is. I'm keeping them anonymous because I respect them and I care about them a lot. And I believe in their ideas. I believe in their project, and I want it to succeed. But at the same time, maybe we have to take a moment and think about what's best for the players and not myself. What's going to make the players happy, not me happy. So take a moment. If you're a game master, take a moment. And if you're a player, maybe think about that. Maybe think about some things that your GM is doing that is going a little too far, that's pushing your boundaries. Speak up. Please, speak up when you get the chance. Because if you don't, then they will step over it. They'll continue stepping over it. I'm someone who's passive. I'm very passive. I endured a lot. I let a lot of things happen. But I'm learning more and more that I should step up. If no one else is going to say anything or do something, I got to step up to the plate. And especially if it's something that I really want to succeed for the players. So that is really it. If you made it to the end of this giant video, thank you for watching. Please, I don't care what you do. In fact, all I want you to do is that if you are in a group that is experiencing something like this, please just share this video with them so that they can see that they're not alone. Because I've experienced this before, and I'm gonna stick through to this because now I'm in the hot seat with others, and we can make this game the best that it can be. And we're gonna work towards that. We're gonna make this game work and succeed as best as we can. So that's it. See ya.